is then. Okay, well, we'll have a chance to meet, chat, and get to know one another over the next day. But I did want to, say that this is a bit of an institution here at Columbia. The Buell Center has been conducting, been running these colloquia every 2 years for over a decade, and it's almost decades plural. But and we have also scattered in the audience various alumni from years past. So it's very nice to have many generations of participants in one way or another in this kind of like little institution within the institution here at Columbia, but also at the Buell Center. My hope with these colloquia has always been, first of all, to in a way welcome colleagues into an academic community. Of course, the sort of local community here at Columbia and in New York, but also more generally, particular layers or dimensions of that community, the kind of culture of the conference, and so on and so forth. With which many of our participants are only becoming familiar, shall we say, now. And this is one reason that we do these panels. In the last few of these colloquia we've been doing, rather than sort of a keynote lecture or address in a kind of formal sense, we've been doing what we call keynote panels. In the spirit of a kind of opening discussion that addresses one way or the other aspects of the intellectual, cultural, and institutional work we all do together in one way or another, and we'll be addressing in much more, as it were, scientific detail tomorrow. So for this evening's panel, titled, as you can see, enigmatically Finding Wright, and I think you know who Wright may or not be here, wherever he may be. We have with us our close colleagues, Carole and Fabian and Barry Bergdoll, to, in a sense, invite us into this wonderful acquisition of the sort of move of the Frank Lloyd Wright Archive to New York. From the Wright Foundation to New York in the interinstitutional collaboration of represented by MoMA and Columbia here, or Avery Library specifically, and the Arts and Architecture Department and MoMA. So Barry's going to be wearing his his MoMA hat today. Maybe he'll switch a little, but that is something about this community that I'm talking about. That there's the geography is dispersed both, locally and internationally, and so it's part of our way of trying to make sense of what it means to have to work in and guide a center, the Buell Center, dedicated to the study of American architecture, and I think we'll hear a bit about this one way or the other, because it's an important dimension of the move to New York is in a sense the putting of Wright in a different world that still contains America, but isn't entirely circumscribed by that signifier, whatever it may mean. Beyond that, I'm going to actually allow Carole and Barry to tell you. I'm under strict instructions not actually to give to introduce further this acquisition. I think many of you, most of you, probably know something about it, but if you don't, you're going to hear in delicious detail, I think, many of the very interesting backstories, or at least the institutional intentions and desires, even. Maybe not all the backstories, right? Associated with the archive and its move. Okay, so my remaining task is then only to introduce to you our panelists. First, Carole and Fabian, who is the director of the Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library at Columbia, here at Columbia University, one of the most comprehensive architecture and arts library collections in the world, indeed the library of record in the United States. For the history of architecture. As Avery director, she oversees strategic directions and daily operations of the Avery Library, including, which is much more than a library, as I think you'll hear, including bibliographic and user services, collection development for its extensive research collections, and 3 special collections, Avery Drawings and Archives, Avery Classics, and the office, the rather mysterious Office of Art Properties. She's also responsible for the production, publication, and ongoing innovative development of the Avery Index to Architectural Periodical, which I think every person in this room probably has used in one place, one time or the other, the leading indexing and abstracting publication for the discipline. Prior to joining Columbia University Libraries, Carole held positions at Art Store Digital Library, the University of Buffalo Libraries, RIT Archives, the Getty Research Institute, and the Getty Museum. She's also incoming Vice President / President-elect of the Art Libraries Society of North America, and indeed is project director for several large-scale projects that are actually housed in Avery Library. The Built Works Registry and IMLS National Leadership Grant Project, the Seymour Durst Old York Library Collection, digital library project supported by the Durst Organization Grant, and Avery's American View Books, a Mellon-funded CLIR Hidden Collections Grant, the Future of Art Bibliography, a Getty Crest-funded international initiative. And this is kind of like a very important, let's say, subtext of our maybe concern here, that a library, especially today, is never simply a library, and really this particular very special library has again, one way or the other, helped make our discipline what it is, and I think it obviously continues to do so in this particular situation vis-a-vis the Wright materials. Then following Carole, and then they're going to kind of, I think, bounce around and fold various contributions together. It's Barry Bergdoll, my close colleague here across the way, over there in Schermerhorn, but now today officially representing the Museum of Modern Art, where he's the Philip Johnson Chief Curator in of Architecture and Design. And indeed, as well as being the Professor of Modern Architectural History in the Department of Art History at Columbia. Barry holds a BA from Columbia, an MA from King's College, Cambridge, and a PhD also from Columbia, where his broad interests center on modern architectural history and with a particular emphasis on France and Germany since 1800, so maybe a different spin on the American Frank Lloyd Wright. Bergdoll has organized, curated, as surely you know, and consulted on many major exhibitions of 19th, 20th century architecture, indeed 21st century architecture, at MoMA and elsewhere. On view, those of you who have just arrived in New York, you really must go see this. You can do this on Sunday. Is Henri Labrouste, Structure Brought to Light, this sort of absolutely beautiful show of Labrouste's drawings, and then there are other models and so on, of his these incredible projects that have been brought not just to light, but I think to life in a different way by this show, as already some of the early reviews have shown. There have been other shows, including Foreclosed, organized with the Buell Center. I mean, you've certainly seen some of these. I hope you saw Foreclosed. Rising Currents, Home Delivery, Mies in Berlin, so movement from scholarly to speculative. And so on and so on. I won't list them all. Beginning on Sunday, so we're very lucky to have Barry here, because beginning on Sunday, down in Washington, D.C., apparently already announced in the Washington Post, we are, the sort of academic and cultural community there will be treated to 6 weeks of Barry's lectures in the Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery, titled Out of Sight, in Plain View, on the origins and modernity of the architectural exhibition, in which the exhibition itself is given systematic scholarly treatment. And if that's not enough, you're surely, again, also are aware of the many publications for which Barry has been responsible, either as editor or as author. These include the recent Bauhaus 1919-1933 Workshop for Modernity catalog, award-winning from the Association of Art Museum Curators. Again, the catalog for Home Delivery, another award winner, Philip Johnson Book Award, Mies in Berlin, winner of another Philip Johnson Book Award. In his own scholarly publications, Carl Friedrich Schinkel in Architecture for Prussia, in 1995 AIA Book Award, and Léon Vaudoyer, Historicism for the Age of Industry, as well as the very, very useful teaching text, European Architecture 1750 to 1890 in the Oxford History series. So I think I'll allow the ... to take care of Barry's bibliography, from a bibliography from here, and pass the baton over to our colleagues, first to Carole, then to Barry. The script is basically they're going to present informally aspects of the collection, the acquisition, the collaboration between Avery and MoMA, and then there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions and for us to discuss some of the implications, possibilities, etc. And then we'll go have a drink out in the cafe. So welcome, Barry and Carole. Thanks.
Thank you, Reinhold, and what a treat to be able to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, which has been a story and a secret for Barry and me for a couple of years. And now it's good that we can finally talk about it among colleagues, old and new. And so this evening, we thought we would, as Reinhold said, give a rather casual narrative about what makes a project like this come to be. And why it in particular, aside from the magnitude and beauty of the Wright Archive itself, what makes it a special thing to celebrate between not only MoMA and Columbia and Avery Library, but for the whole community as a new way of working. And so I'm going to give just a brief introduction about what those aspects are, what makes this collaboration so extraordinary. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to Barry, who's going to talk about Wright in the context of MoMA, and then back to me to talk about Wright in the context of Avery and its various collections and missions. And then together we'll talk about the collection itself. We're going to do that at warp speed, so there's plenty of time for you to ask questions and to have more, as Reinhold hoped, I think, more of a conversation or a dialogue about what it means to be the stewards of a great iconic collection such as the Wright Archive, and what that means for our community to collectively engage in such an archive. So the story began more than 2 years ago, and I had only been at Avery for 1 year at that time, I think, and I knew of Barry by reputation, of course, and of other colleagues here, and one day he came by and said, would I have time to talk to him for a minute about something? And I said, sure, anytime. Ooh, Barry Bergdoll's coming to talk. So he came and very, very quietly and sympathetically said, so what would you think about getting the Frank Lloyd Wright archives together? It was amazing. I almost fell off my chair. I'm like, well, he said, would you be interested in talking about that? I said, yes, I'd be very interested. And he began then to tell the story of how the opportunity came to MoMA, and then how he and Glenn Lowry, the director of MoMA, spoke together and thought that it might be a great opportunity to do something really special, and that is to develop a cross-institutional partnership with the joint goal of bringing the Wright Archive in a more lively and present way to the world stage here in New York, with shared stewardship between our two organizations. We had many conversations about what that might look like. It is not the tradition in acquiring institutions to do so in partnership. In general, most acquisitions are made, uniquely to one institution. We do have examples in the field where there are partnerships that have service relationships, where a museum might acquire something and another museum may display it, or an archive may do it. We loan all the time to different archives, but to do something, hand in glove, to do it purposefully, to see how the cultures of two places, the strengths of two places could come together to really celebrate and expand upon and invite the interrogation of the community into an archive. was, and I think is, something quite special and unique that we do. This is a quote from President of Columbia, Lee Bollinger. You can all read it. I don't need to read it to you, but I think that it does encapsulate in some ways the thinking and the conversations that we had over quite a long time. So the two of us coming together and saying, yeah, this is a good thing, representing our two organizations, was just sort of the start of an 18-month process of narration and internally trying to come up with, what would be a strategic focus of this kind of collaboration, what would be the distribution of responsibilities when you co-own it. It's not that they're getting a piece and you're getting a piece, but we actually are doing things together. How do you integrate two institutions who, although have some mission alignment, also have some things that distinguish us from each other? What a museum does, an academic institution does not, and vice versa. Both of us bring tremendous strengths and tremendous leadership in those areas in the field of architectural investigation and research. So we tried to find that uniqueness and make a compelling argument to the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, who was asking, by virtue of an RFP, for several organizations to step forward and create a vision of what they thought would be best for this legacy collection of arguably certainly one of America's greatest architects and an icon of architectural modernism more generally in the world. So we went through this 18-month process, which started as general writing and narrative, and then over the course of time, as it narrowed down to be, yes, the dance was happening between the foundation and MoMA and Avery, down to a very prolonged, not so painful, I like legal things, but making a legal document that would bind us together in this way. So what transpired in the end was that the collections, the archive, held since Wright's death in 1959, had been held by the Taliesin, Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, but housed at both Taliesins, meaning Taliesin and Taliesin West, Wisconsin and Arizona. And all the materials that are in those collections and housed there since his death would migrate over the course of years, actually, to Avery and to MoMA in two discrete parts. Loosely, you could describe it as the paper-based material coming into the Avery collection and the three-dimensional materials going into the MoMA collection for the purpose of stewardship of those kinds of objects. And then the things that we would do with those we'll get to a little bit later in the distribution of what we're going to do with them. But the joint acquisition itself, this is just sort of the facts of the matter. More than 25,000 architectural drawings. I have in the audience today is Shelley Hayra, who's the Avery archivist, and worked closely with our curator of drawings and archives, Janet Parks, who I don't think is with us this evening. But they just got back from a 2-week adventure, I think we could call it, at Taliesin West to begin the inventory and packing of the collection, which resulted in, after 2 weeks, 28,000 pounds of paper coming to Avery. That's the first of a shipment that'll begin a 5-year process of moving parts and parcel of it. But in this first move, those architectural drawings of Mr. Wright will come. 300,000 archival documents, primarily correspondence between Wright and all sorts of people that he corresponded with. Historical photography of the man plus documentary photography of the works. Manuscripts of his own writings, media in all types, audio and film and pictures of them having dance, musical creations, all kinds of things that happened at both the Taliesins, and then lots and lots of media files. And then in the 3D material, there are architectural models, which Barry will talk to this evening, architectural elements and design prototypes, and then many, many hidden wonders. The archives of Olga Vanna Wright, lost or unknown works by Louis Sullivan, and unbelievably other. As Janet would go through the drawers, she'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe this is in here too. So it's going to be a treasure trove of new finds for people. And by bringing the collection here to New York, we'll open it up, I think, to a worldwide audience in ways that we hadn't seen before. We will also be acquiring the Taliesin Associated Architects files, which are the follow-on organization from Wright after 1959. That'll come in the last couple of years, probably, of the transition. So in the archive is everything from the back of napkin genius sketch to the very fancy and wonderful renderings that some of you are familiar with, and everything in between. And so I'm going to pass the speaker over now to Barry, and you can talk a little bit about the context at MoMA, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about what's going on at Avery. John, you want to transition to Barry's slide? Are you there? Yeah, here we go. Thanks.
Great. I was really hoping to follow immediately on Reinhold's introduction, because it was, very long and detailed. And of course, the genre of the introduction is to prove the unique competence of the speaker to address the subject at hand. But it actually was an introduction that really demonstrated the unique incompetence of the speaker with absolutely no expertise whatsoever in Frank Lloyd Wright. So therefore, I'm not even going to attempt it. I'm going to give you a very disorganized presentation that I hope will dovetail a bit with some of the things that Carole has just told you about the rationale for the move to New York, which, as you can imagine, raised a certain number of eyebrows. Frank Lloyd Wright in New York, and as well as some of the rationale of the collaboration. Maybe just to put a little more fat on the good skeletal organization that Carole has just given us. And then I want to talk a little bit about the models themselves in relationship to Wright as a practitioner of exhibitions, which is a really interesting topic. You've heard it interests me. So this is what I'm thinking about in relationship to this material. And, Janet's phone calls from Taliesin West. I'm going to be showing you primarily photographs here from Taliesin East, where the models were and were moved to MoMA already now a couple of months ago. Generated the excitement that not only does the context change, what happens when you put Frank Lloyd Wright, and this was one of our arguments, what happens when you put Frank Lloyd Wright in one of the world's great collections of architecture and design, and one of the oldest museum department of architecture and design, and therefore a place with an 80-plus year track record of exhibiting architecture and therefore I'm going to try to show you dovetailing with actually something of Wright's practice, but also, and of course this was very compelling, the CEO PowerPoint we would have Picasso, we would have Matisse, we would have Jackson Pollock, we would have Jasper Johns, and we would say, as we did, Frank Lloyd Wright thought of himself as one of the great artists. These are the people he wanted to talk to. He did not want to talk uniquely to the architects across the continent. He thought of himself as not only an international architect, but an international artist, dialoguing with his own particular vision, and it's highly idiosyncratic and completely fascinating, as much he would like to think as with his own followers, as perhaps with those whom he sparred on many occasions. And then, of course, on the architectural front, Carole can speak to how Frank Lloyd Wright fits into the collections at Avery, both comprehensive and specific holdings in the archives. In our case, and this for just a bit of anecdotal backstory, when I received a set of phone calls and correspondence about participating in this RFP and sat down with Glenn Lowry, we both immediately said, this is like a real problem, because historically there are two modes, in a sense, if you will, an alpha and omega of collecting architectural materials. And I think Avery represents one end of the spectrum, and MoMA has historically represented the exact opposite. And I have now, for a number of years, been trying to find some middle ground. That is to say that Avery collects archives and MoMA does not. And MoMA was founded and talk about that in a minute through some examples. MoMA was founded to be a proselytizing institution through the temporary exhibition that would leave no residue behind in the building. And slowly over time, a collection began to kind of happen without anybody really planning what it would be. There are in the archives of MoMA various moments when some retrospective attempt to define what an architecture department, a collecting architecture and later architecture and design department would do, but there is no founding manifesto for that. It's a little bit like our collaboration, Carole, and you kind of invent it as you go along, because it is in a bit like 1932 when the trustees took the plunge to have an architecture department and then tried to figure out what it would be and how it would work, a little bit how we're working. We thought this is a brilliant idea. We're going to try to pull it off on them, and then we'll figure out among ourselves how it will work. The paradox, however, of the MoMA collection, as I always say in secret downtown, is we don't collect archives. This is the best collection of modern architecture in this country because we have the Mies van der Rohe archive. So there is an incredible paradox. We don't collect archives, but we're incredibly strong because we have an archive. It has always been a real problem in its scale. Some 22,000 drawings, a complete correspondence of Mies van der Rohe, of what he considered to be his office correspondence. His personal correspondence is in the Library of Congress. So unlike the Mies van der Rohe archive here, the entire correspondence is together. I'm still, to this day, I've spent many hours in the Library of Congress, unsure what that meant, because Mies van der Rohe moved his bed into the bathroom so that he could use the rest of the apartment for his office. So I don't actually know how he affected the division between what constituted office and what constituted personal correspondence. So the Wright archive is not only bigger, but it is actually, in that sense, more integral. Anyway, back to the open parenthesis, I said to Glenn, he said, but do you want another archive? And I said, let me put it this way. Traditionally, one speaks of 4 or 5 great makers of modern architecture. That's the subject of conferences that have been held in this building. And they all actually have an archive that is a place of pilgrimage. The Mies van der Rohe archive is, of course, at MoMA. The Le Corbusier archive is at the Le Corbusier Foundation. The Alvar Aalto archive is in the Aalto Foundation. And then up to you whether you want the fourth figure here to be Walter Gropius, whose archive is primarily at Harvard University and partly at the Bauhaus archive in Berlin. And then, of course, there's Frank Lloyd Wright, whose archive is in the woods and dells of Wisconsin and in the desert of Arizona. And I said, and we could actually say that until I got this phone call, no one would assume that any of that was changing. So this is the only time that 2 of the greatest archives of the protean masters, not only in terms of their own work, but in terms of their influence in the forming of schools, would actually come together. And then, of course, we had to excavate from the Mies archive that great line when Mies gave his first public lecture. And probably many of you know this story, at the Palmer House in Chicago upon arrival in his thick German accent, and Frank Lloyd Wright was asked to introduce him. Uncharacteristically laconic, he stood up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mies van der Rohe. Without me, there would be no Mies van der Rohe." And then he sat down. So, it's clear these 2 archives had to come together. Absolutely. So there are some of the arguments. So let me just, after that completely casual introduction, get even more casual. I put together a PowerPoint that is still in a rather rough form, as though it would be much nicer if we were around a big table with some real materials out and discussing this. But I wanted to make 2 points that I don't think are terribly well known, that when they're put together, make a very, very compelling case for Avery MoMA. One is that, and therefore New York. One is this statement written by Edgar Kaufman Jr. in a little-known article, but a very good one, on Frank Lloyd Wright's Architecture Exhibited. So Frank Lloyd Wright as a practitioner and a curator of his own exhibitions. The only other text of this sort is the first sketch of a forthcoming book by the great Wright scholar Catherine Smith that is in this MoMA publication that I will be plagiarizing in public tonight. So this is why actually Reinhold should not have invited me to speak to doctoral students in the making, because this is an entire symposium about original research, and Carole and I are showing you raw materials, and for synthesis, I, at least for one, am going to plagiarize from Edgar Kaufman and Catherine Smith. Edgar Kaufman writes, on the occasion of the acquisition by the Metropolitan Museum of Art of the single room from the Little House, installed, I mean, the idea of a single period room from a Prairie House plan is so phenomenally weird, but in any case, writes on that occasion about Wright exhibiting, and he says, during Wright's working life, there was scarcely a year when his work was not being exhibited publicly, except the period 1917 to 1928, more or less corresponds to what Anthony Olafson calls the last decades, when he was working in Japan and the Western American states. And then he goes on in great detail to tell us about this exhibition activity. So we all know the longevity of Wright's career, that by the time he had his great retrospective at MoMA in 1940, he was in his 70s. Not exactly a young Turk. The other factoid I'd like to put together with this is when I arrived at MoMA 5 or 6 years ago and began these occasional seminars in which Columbia students came down to the museum and we worked in the archives, and maybe there are people who were in one of those seminars who are actually here tonight, and that was has been a very, very heady experience. The very first thing I studied, and it's available to you online, was the list of all of the some 300 architecture and design exhibitions that have been done since the department was created as a result of the so-called International Style Show, which in a certain sense is exhibition 0 of the Department of Architecture, because it was a trial balloon to see if anybody would come to an architecture exhibition. It is not, as is most frequently written, the first exhibition of the Department of Architecture. It was a test case to prove to the trustees that the impossible idea of having an architecture department could actually work. But when you go through that list of 300 and you are looking for the people who most frequently appear, of course you expect to see in the notion of the international style, maybe we should actually prove how poorly put together this PowerPoint is. Where's the little clicker guy? Okay. Just jump ahead for a second. We'll come back to those in a minute. 1932, you would probably expect from these well-known photographs that it would be either Le Corbusier or perhaps Gropius with the Bauhaus, perhaps less than Frank Lloyd Wright, who has a very ambiguous relationship to that exhibition and to that whole project of a 10-year survey of the period 1922 to 1932, corresponding almost exactly to the period when Frank Lloyd Wright had not been exhibiting. However, Frank Lloyd Wright is the single most exhibited architect in the entire history of the Museum of Modern Art. He hardly made a move that did not get registered at one scale or another in the museum between his first appearance in this kind of trial run exhibition, famous and infamous exhibition, and the huge exhibition that Terry Riley and Peter Reed did in 1994, and I have some images of that at the very end. So I think that's a very interesting and a very compelling point, and the whole notion, besides the Guggenheim and the napkins from the plaza, and of course the St. Mark's project, that Frank Lloyd Wright did not have a relationship to New York is hardly tenable. So I think those two things are interesting to put together and would in fact be an extremely interesting research to undertake properly. I can only give you impressions about it tonight. So let's go back for just a moment to excite you about the transition that's taken place. This is probably one of the most exhibited of all of Frank Lloyd Wright's models, and it will be the one that we will exhibit, I hope, by Christmas time in an inaugural presentation of some materials, just some very first materials from this archival acquisition. And it is, of course, the great four-part model of Broadacre City. Here exhibited on the wall, although in most of its presentations by Frank Lloyd Wright, it was exhibited on the floor. And here in the, this is one of my favorite of the acquisition, is this highway overpass that is also related to the group of materials that survived from the Broadacre City models. So something on the order of, depending on how you count them, between 40 and 50 models that have arrived. They are almost uniquely, and that's why I want to talk to you about exhibitions, they are almost uniquely models that were made for exhibition. They are not models that represent Wright's working process. They do not come out of the design phases. They come out of this obsessive exhibitioning of himself, exposing of himself, if you will, in various venues, beginning with the Chicago Art Society, then the Art Institute of Chicago. In the early years, Berlin, and then around the time of the Wassermuth portfolio, although there are no photographs of that exhibition that was related to the Wassermuth publication. That, I think, is something to try to bring back together, the history of Wright's publishing and depicting his architecture and this activity of exhibiting it. But after 1932, the argument could probably be made, and it's up to one of you to see if it holds up, that one of Wright's preferred venues was MoMA. It was never easy, but I don't think anything was ever easy with this guy, as we'll see in a moment. So this is the context, in the best context, at Taliesin West in Spring Green, Wisconsin, where these models were. These were the ones that were on exhibition for the summer exhibition. This is a not heated building. And sometimes they would stay for the winter in this building, sometimes awaiting the spring reopening of the site. One of the reasons that the models arrived earlier than the drawings is not only because it was a whole separate logistical organization and because they were in Wisconsin as opposed to Arizona for the most part, although I think there are a few stragglers that are coming that Janet has seen, was that it was necessary to get them out before the first snow because they were to be accessed off dirt roads. So this has been an unbelievably complicated operation. This is a Price Tower model. And then I think we have this, an incredibly important model. You'll see it in a moment in a photograph of an exhibition designed and installed by Wright himself at the Art Institute. It is, of course, the St. Mark's Tower model, and probably designed, therefore, for that exhibition, not part of the design phase of St. Mark's. We have in the collection at MoMA some very beautiful drawings already, so this one alone was exciting. But this is just to kind of give you a flavor of my trip to Wisconsin. Carole and I went together to Taliesin. It was my first experience of 118 degrees. I was jet lagged, tried out the hotel swimming pool with the sunrise. It was August at about 5 a.m. Apparently it was the last time you could access the pool without burning your feet. We were told tales of rattlesnakes, etc. That's the conditions in the desert. This model stood on top of a bookcase in the upper part of the home school, a really brilliant early design, almost kind of early study for Unity Temple and all of those, and for Larkin for that matter, in a mezzanine level, 6-stack-high bookcase, so you couldn't even reach it, on a floor that every time somebody walked, the whole bookcase rocked. And the model looked like a weather vane. And the operation was, can it even survive its removal from the bookcase into some kind of soft wrap to try to get it to New York? So I just want to emphasize it's not only something of the adventures of this, but how actually urgent it was to get this material moved from where it was. I did not bring you the photographs that were sent to me by the MoMA conservation team who are now working on this, and they are incredible. They've just finished the work on our acquisition of a kitchen from the Unité d'Habitation, which they've done a remarkable job, and they're now tackling this. but the photographs of some of the materials found inside, which were determined in the end not to be mouse droppings, but in fact bat droppings, and therefore required a slightly different conservation and cleaning approach. So this is taking us in many new directions. Will not be under glass, though. Yeah, God, that's not a good one because that's me photographing it. But this is amazing. This is a Guggenheim, an early version of the Guggenheim, of course. Not only when the rotundas are different and flipped, so the big one is on the north side, on the 89th Street side, I guess, but the whole building is lifted up and you can drive under it or walk under it. So we have actually, we've lent it to the Guggenheim on a number of occasions. We have the definitive model. Now we have this earlier stage. It'll be very, very nice to be able to put them together. So that's just a kind of taste of some of this. And then I want to just give you a sense of, so this is, the first sequence is Frank Lloyd Wright at MoMA. He was actually not very happy about the way he was treated in the Modern Architecture International Exhibition, as we know from Terry Riley's reconstruction of it, even though he was presented as the person from whom the Europeans had taken their inspiration as the grandfather of modern architecture rather than one of the leading practitioners, and he was very bent out of shape with Hitchcock and Johnson at that point and with MoMA in general. His room was not the first you got to, so that was also a slightly strange arrangement. But he keeps coming back. He is sent by MoMA in 1938. This is actually, this might be, I'm not actually sure. Oh, this is the Paris presentation. He's sent in 1938 to Paris in an exhibition that was curated by John McAndrew, who was the successor to, not directly, but indirectly the successor to Philip Johnson after Philip Johnson began a rather notorious political career and was on the blacklist at the museum for a number of years. During that period, John McAndrew would pay particular attention to Wright, always with the shadow advisor of the department, Henry Russell Hitchcock. So here is Wright in Paris in 3 centuries of American art. That show then came back to New York. So that show in itself, it was a very good paper done on it by a Columbia student that really ought to be published studying that. This one, there we are in Paris. That's what you actually would see first before you saw the Roby House. And here, one last shot of that. But while that's going on in Paris, much to Wright's annoyance, this is the last exhibition installed in the Museum of Modern Art before it moves into the Goodwin and Stone building. So here we are in the concourse of Rockefeller Center, and this is the installation by Walter Gropius and Herbert Bayer, the exhibition designer of the Bauhaus exhibition of 1938, early 39. So this came down and then almost immediately after the building opened. I think that it's interesting to think about the fact that before they moved into the building with its kind of slightly sub-international style approach, the exhibition that's being planned for the new building, the first architecture exhibition of any significance that will take place in the new building, is a great retrospective of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. And discussion is underway with what Wright says will be of all of things he's done to date the show to end all shows. So the ambitions after these guys got their own show in the temporary quarters to be allowed to plan the first exhibition in the new building. And here is Wright with one of the models that he made for it. And at this point, he develops, and I think this does need to be studied, this rather technicolor polychromatic modeling style with polychromatic gardening and landscape approach that is quite different from the earlier models. And their presentation models, some of them, there's a wonderful one I should have brought in for the Radiant Farm. Some of them come apart, some of the roofs come off and the like, but here he is posing in that show. Very interesting, I think, to think about if you were an architecture groupie following what MoMA did, and there already were some, how radically different Herbert Bayer as an exhibition designer is from Frank Lloyd Wright. So this is Frank Lloyd Wright designing his own exhibition at MoMA. It's a thriller. You have to get this book, Studies in Modern Art, Volume 8 by Peter Reed and Bill Kazin, who was a graduate student here, a doctoral student in the Department of Art History when he worked on this a number of years ago. It is the publication of the catalog that was pulled from press 4 days before the show opened because Wright disagreed with so many things in the text, they just said, finally, forget it, no catalog. The manuscript is in the archives at MoMA, and the whole dramatic story is here, both of the cancellation of this, and as you'll see in a moment, the cancellation of what would have been a real winner, the first full-scale museum house in the garden, also canceled at the last minute. Nonetheless, Wright posed and used the whole occasion, invited the press, did the press list himself, in this exhibition, which the aesthetic of which had been defined in his own exhibition style. This is just one of them. This is his own traveling exhibition, 1930-31. There is that model of St. Mark's Tower. And I think the thing that's interesting to think about this, and this is kind of what I'm trying to do in this history of architectural exhibitions, is most architectural exhibitions are studied independently of one another in the monograph of person X or person Y, instead of it being in a discursive field or literally a geographical field. So that is to say that the 1932 show that traveled all over the country from MoMA was kind of following behind Wright's own traveling show, which he had done a year before, but I've never seen a discussion that pulled those two together, and so one is waiting to happen. And Wright had this idea that the architectural exhibition should be like coming to his studio. And so the things should be pinned up, they should be on tables, as you will see downtown. I like that idea too, but I like a little less profusion, and that you really should feel as though the architect was there a minute before. And perhaps if you have money to pay him, that he'd come back any minute. And this incredible mix of materials and the typeset, very, very cluttered, but deliberately cluttered. So he has his own aesthetic. Very, very different when other people get their hands on it, because this exhibition also traveled abroad, and this is what the Dutch do with it. So there is a whole field to be studied here. Now, Catherine Smith is at work on it. Perhaps next year, Reinhold, you should get her to come and talk about that once the materials are actually here. So there's the exhibition, right, and some influence. There's again, the St. Mark's Tower as it appeared in the installation of the show here in Berlin, accompanied by all of the infamous drawings that Wright made when he redrew his work for the Princeton lectures. It's always said he redrew them for the Princeton lectures. He drew them because, I should have done this. They said, hey, would you give X number of lectures? And he said, no, I'm going to give a fewer than that. And the last lecture will be an exhibition. I need an exhibition as well. And so he redrew all of his drawings to make them appear more in accordance with the current international style. So there is a dialogue between those two. And there they all come together. There's actually Wright attending the opening of the Bauhaus exhibition. So that's a wonderful picture. There are a lot of social shots in the archives at MoMA. Here are the students working on some of the models. This is the great model of wing spread, which is now at MoMA. So these actually models, in a certain sense, have returned home, some of them. And this is the drawing, which also has returned home, for what would have been the first Usonian house that was meant to continue the exhibition, which was on the ground floor of the Durrell Stone building and Goodwin building, into the garden itself. Now, of course, this is not the Philip Johnson garden that you all know and love, even in its radically transformed state, but rather, that's the filing permit with the city. That was a problem, and I know it from home delivery. Frank Lloyd Wright wanted radiant heating, and they said, you can't have radiant heating. This is an exhibition object. And he said, no, it's an important part of the Usonian thing. So, of course, the buildings department has a tremendous problem with the fact that he's outfitting this as though you could sleep in it, rather than the way I filed all of the buildings in home delivery as sculpture art projects, which was the only way to get it done. But anyway, this is the context. The Usonian house would have been in John McAndrew's garden, right in that open space behind the glazed facade, but it too was canceled at the last minute. And I could go on and on. I just put these together in such profusion because I want to prove my point that Wright is really the kind of red thread that runs through the entire exhibition history of MoMA, both in exhibitions dedicated to him, but over and over again, whether it's the seminal built in USA of Elizabeth Mock, where Falling Water and Jacob's House and others appear, dedicated shows, A New Country House by Frank Lloyd Wright. That's another view of that. And Taliesin and Taliesin West get their own show. So the kind of updates of what he's up to. Interesting to see that that ends in June 47, just a few months before Mies opens his great installation designed by him. So that's not only the dialogue of figures, but even the dialogue of the 20th century culture of exhibiting architects as curators, publicists of their own work, and the like. An amazing season. Here is Frank Lloyd Wright, A New Theater, in 1949. So that's a project for Hartford that was never realized, overlapping with Marcel Breuer's House in the Garden, which has certain Wrightian aspects to it. So I think there are also kinds of dialogues that haven't been thought about that can be discovered in the archive's Midtown home. And Carole Ann's going to tell us about what it can be discovered in our Uptown home. One could go on and on. Into the 50s, right to his death, Wright is being exhibited over and over again. And right before he dies in 59, in 58, he is exhibited in the first ever exhibition at MoMA that is actually a historic preservation exhibition in 1958. It's related, of course, to the founding of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the beginning of, obviously, not fully successful, of course, we owe it on the Bank of Sullivan, still standing, but one of the great losses of all times, the Larkin Building in Buffalo, but a plea at MoMA that should be saved. And I think Carole Ann probably knows this better than I, that by that point it was already in danger. Visionary architecture 1 year after Frank Lloyd Wright, probably the first great show based on the idea of drawing itself, in which the Mile High, but these are not original drawings, they're reproductions. In 1960, Arthur Drexler. Then, 2 years later, a huge show of actual drawings, Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings. So many of these two back here having been shown in a very large show in 62. And then there is a bit of a gap. And this is Terry Riley's first big exhibition, 1994. And just to show you what it looked like. Something that we'll be looking at when we think of what the exhibition that we hope to create in 5 or 6 years' time will look like. I think it should be an exhibition that actually makes good on what I just said. It should not be a monograph on Frank Lloyd Wright. It should somehow fulfill the potential of being in two new contexts, the context of the Museum of Modern Art and the context of the Avery Library, to which Carole Ann is now going to turn. Have these incredible full-scale building mock-ups. That's coming back. That's not, that's a fake. And there's Broadacre on an incline table. Carole Ann, do you want to take over?
Thank you, Barry. Are we going to go back? There, there. Okay. So this is now to say what is the context of bringing the Wright Archives into Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library. And this little sweet piece, it's about this big, is already in Avery. And Avery has, it's very, very lovely. It's this little typed note and pen sketch to Mr. M.H. Lowell. And it's a sketch for a studio. And in it, you can't probably read it from there, but one of the things towards the end he says, "You are probably as good a judge as I am, but say," he's asking how much would it cost to build the studio, $1,000. "If you want us to carry out the design with details, we would charge you $100. So in 1901, you could get a Frank Lloyd Wright building and Frank Lloyd Wright for $100. Sounds good. No longer the case. But at any rate, this is to say that Avery has collected Wright, just as MoMA has, throughout its very long history, under the leadership of Paula Gilbert, who is the bibliographer for our head of bibliography, and Chris Sala. They purchase and acquire for us every research volume, every published on or by Wright. In our rare books department, we also collect all of the rare volumes published by Wright. We have 3 Wasmuth portfolios, for example, 3 House Beautifuls signed by Wright, just extraordinarily beautiful works that are already part of our tradition of collecting. But when you drop Wright into Avery's collection, it's not only into that rich pool of the material that is about him, but it's also about this history of architecture, from the earliest printed books on architecture from the Renaissance up to the present day. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to very, very quickly romp through some images that take you from the Renaissance to the middle of the 20th century to show you just tantalizing, snippets of things that Avery acquires in ACES. So we have about 2 million architectural works in the archives, and about 40,000 architectural rare books having to do exclusively with architecture. So this, I'm just going to start in the 16th century. This is from an album, and I would like to thank Carole Yerkes, who's the curator of rare books, who helped me put this together, as well as Janet Parks, the curator of drawings, who selected some pieces too. This in 18th century, the Turgot plan for Paris. Our Piranesi are world-renowned, many of them given as part of the Sackler gifts. This presentation drawing from 1764-ish. This was recently acquired in 18th century Italian manuscripts. We have many, many, many beautiful manuscript editions bound together and in the Classics collection, even though they are original drawings rather than published works. This is actually featured in Barry's show at MoMA right now. It's a manuscript by Henri Labuste from 1826. Then we move into the 19th century in America with a fabulous collection of works by Alexander Jackson Davis. This is hand drawing and watercolor for the Ravine Walk, followed by, maybe stuck? There we go. Cass Gilbert, when he was a student at MIT, this is one of his final presentation drawings in 1869 of the restoration of Pompeii. We are full of many things from the turn of the century, particularly as they focus on New York and the many, many iron frame and other construction types here in the city. Ephemera of all kind. This is a fabulous photograph album, St. Louis in an actual walnut shell. And we have lots and lots of things like that, total treats about how architecture has been represented. The full Green and Green archive in photographic and drawing is also part of our collections. That's from the Gamble House, 1907. The drawings of Hugh Ferris, some say the 20th century's Piranesi, renderer of fabulous works, and this one from 1925 of the Chicago Tribune Tower. Thomas Lamb's United Palace Theater here in New York. The scale of drawings and the artistry of drawings and the work of architects in practice is one of the particular focuses that delights Janet. So we have an enormously wonderful, rich collection of drawings by people practicing in and around New York. This is one of the things from our Philip Johnson collection. We have a lot of Philip Johnson. This is a drawing of the Glass House Guest House. Felix Candela, we had a major retrospective exhibition, traveled to 2 locations in Spain, Mexico City, and to New York just last year. This is a photo of one of his things, but we also are the archive of record for Candela. Max Abramovich, again, one of Janet's favorites. This is an absolutely stunning rendering of Philharmonic Hall, now Avery Fischel Hall at Lincoln Center. You think Mad Men has something going on? This is just well beyond anything that can be imagined by our costume designers. Really a lovely drawing. One drawing by Eli Jacques Kahn and Robert Allen Jacobs for the Reinhold Pavilion at the World's Fair. One of my particular favorites, this Neutra drawing of the Pesker House. And that takes us to just a pause to say, why do we do this? I mean, we have just, mountains and mountains of things, and why do we do it more, and why do we vary it? And I say this is the thing to do. It's for the benefit of the community, not only to preserve save it from these sorts of settings that Barry was describing. Particularly the models were not in particularly sound housings. The drawings, on the other hand, were rescued by Olga Vanna from the studio and taken to Taliesin West in the desert, dry, very hot, and locked up into vaults, some of them very impermanent for many years, but more recently in proper architectural housings, flat files and such, in temperature-controlled rooms, and so that we have, one of the first, I guess I often call him, a starchitect, somebody who knew of his own greatness in his own time, as Barry has well documented tonight. And so every scrap of evidence from his career is represented in the archive. And we save that not only for the legacy of the man, but for the benefit of the community, for the research and teaching endeavors that go on here and throughout the world. So what does it mean to us? I'm going to whip through this. This is the 5-year timeline of kind of what we did, that phase 1 that we talked about initially, going through the proposal and agreement stages. The second is this planning and implementation stage that we are living through now, 6 months of planning one first shipment of the paper-based material, and Barry's team working on the 3D materials. And then beginning this year, anticipating, as Barry said, a highlights exhibition, a celebratory exhibition sometime coming up around Christmas or shortly thereafter, and then later into 2016, 2017, a major exposition. And so all the work that we do are focusing on those and opening the collection to research as early as this fall and incrementally over that 5-year period. And so what will we be doing? As I say, the first activities center around collection access, the move and the ingest of the collection into our 2 repositories, and then developing together an information architecture. And this is one of the true, I think, innovative components of it. The way museums keep records about objects in their care and the way archives and libraries do things for bibliographic and archival material. They're all different systems. They're all different descriptive standards. And all of those must be meshed together with an eye to what does the researcher of the future expect in their discovery of materials. So this is a tremendous challenge, and for me, one of the really fun things, doing the data. So the processing priorities get set as a part of that, setting up our policies for how the material will be used and presented. This is, again, more about this initial investigation of what are the descriptive strategies for each of the kinds of materials, and then what are the platforms that they'll actually sit on, the technical platforms. How will those speak to each other in a way that makes sense to the users of the collection, and then how do we preserve and present that material going forward in all of its analog and digital forms, because I think you would all expect that there will be a digitization component to presenting this material. So that brings us back to Frank Lloyd Wright, and I just wanted to close with a few slides of a few of the highlights that are included in the paper-based components of the collections. This is a drawing or a photograph that I like very much of Mr. Wright at his drafting table. There is the history of his life in his mother's scrapbook with Janet unearthed, quite an amazing object in its own right. And also photo documentation in Olga Vanna's files, the rendering for the Darwin Martin House. This is a very beautiful thing. Janet tells me it's a little bit tarted up here, a little bit too intense in the color, but it's the slide that I had. Quite lovely. The Unity Temple, these are marching in kind of chron order. This is one of those Princeton drawings, if we can call them that, from the Larkin Administration Building. And for me, the Larkin Building drawings, which I think are number up to about 500, and the Imperial Hotel drawings in Tokyo, about 900 to 1,000 drawings. These 2 works no longer extant. This is our record. This is our evidence. And that they're so richly preserved in the drawing sets is remarkable, and I think going to be a tremendous boon to scholarship. The iterative drawings for the Guggenheim, that together with the models that Barry described, incredible record of the creative process. A later work, 1945, Seacliff in San Francisco, also unbuilt works in addition to the no longer extant, the things that were no longer built, so the things that are following the visionary. I think that the plan for Greater Baghdad falls into that category for sure. And that's kind of the quick wrap-up of what we have. It's going to be wonderful, and we very much look forward to welcoming you to see the collection by appointment at Avery Drawing and Archives starting this fall. So thank you.
Okay, well, there's always a lot, isn't there? And more to say, no doubt, and more to discuss. One thing I have to say, given the context that we're in here, as you guys are speaking, I was trying to remember, maybe somebody can remember, whether there was ever a paper on Frank Lloyd Wright in the Buell Dissertation Colloquium. I'm sure there was, but it's not the most common, strangely, sort of in this kind of self-evidence and obviousness of this on the one hand, and yet, and certainly when you look at the titles and the archives, sure, this is where I'm getting at, for tomorrow, Wright might be between the lines, and maybe he'll show up now and then. I don't know, but certainly not in the foreground.
We do have a paper on Marion Money.
Yes, of course, yes. And so, there's, this is related particularly to the kind of the putting Wright in a different context question that Barry raised. I mean, maybe not a different context, but in a sense to sort of maybe place a slightly different emphasis on his many contexts. And what, in kind of proceeding with this rather complicated exercise of first of all, acquiring the thing, and now in some sense you're already interpreting it. I mean, of course, in terms of the institutional backdrop, like the exhibition at MoMA, but even in as you're saying here, like there are certain important elements and certain less important. How do we make sense of an archive under the historical conditions in which the archive itself is in a sense a methodological question? That this is what and again, it will be self-evident, I think, tomorrow. What do you think? I mean, either in terms of the kind of things at Avery that people tend to ask about these days, or indeed this whole problem that Barry, you started with, the archive that is or isn't an archive, the Nice one, and then the same one with Wright, and after all, what is in a sense the agency of the archive as a sort of site, but also in a sense a producer in its own right of knowledge in our field. What do you think?
Well, I think that
Yeah, Catherine's good. Well, we're going.
I would just say that I think one of the things to be discovered in the documents to come will be the history of the archive itself. Now, I am perfectly capable of citing work to be done, on which there's already an extensive bibliography, because I am not well read in matters Frank Lloyd Wright. I do think, though, that I just had one thought while you were speaking, which is I think from the point of view of Columbia University, Wright has always been incredibly important, but not fashionable. So it's quite...
Sorry?
Oh, I said I think that Frank Lloyd Wright, at least in this school, has always been incredibly important, but never fashionable. So that I don't know that, with the exception of Anthony Olofsson maybe 30 years ago, that there have been many Frank Lloyd Wright dissertations that have come out of either GSAPP or art history, or for that matter, American studies. But anyway, you wanted to say something, Catherine?
Yeah, I
Doesn't
think that I'm not a Frank Lloyd Wright scholar either.
Nevertheless.
But, but I've been around it a long time, so it seems to me just a staggering acquisition to begin with, in the sense that it's coming into a proper archival relationship to itself, out of a very improper archival relation, but a kind of also casual, interesting, dynamic, but falling apart, sort of thing. But what struck me about the strangeness of the lack of scholarship around Wright is due to a kind of closure to the archive prior to now, So I would say that the bringing of the archive into this situation is contradictory in the sense that it's excellent for the proper archiving of the material, but it's also absolutely crucial and it also provides in this massively new way a kind of openness to it. Yeah. So, and that coupled with the curatorial condition of MoMA suggests that maybe what what is to be curated is not the right work right away. And I'm sure there's a lot of different things one could do, but actually the curation of new scholarship around it, meaning the invitation of, curating entirely different kinds of people working on it or something. I don't know, because it's just become so, I mean, the personality has swamped, in a sense, the scholarship at some level, and yet that's always the case, maybe. But I just see this, the incredible opportunity, but this curatorial archival relationship for just kind of cracking that open.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the foundation, who recognized their board and the leadership there, that they were doing somewhat of a disservice. They had done a fabulous job for a number of decades in just keeping the stuff together and making sure that it didn't become distributed too broadly in terms of the physical artifact. But by holding it that way, it did, I think, limit scholarly access, certainly by the remoteness of the locations, and the limited service model they had, actually. So one of the most compelling parts of our argument was this opportunity to investigate the collection. At the same time, it became extremely available to researchers, the general public, students in the teaching environment here or in their own pursuit of degrees, that they would find the new question by placing it within these broader contexts, either in the context of the art museum or in the large archive and research library, where often the investigation doesn't start with the man, but with the thematic, with the building type, with the idea of a certain kind of arch or a certain kind of foundation or a certain a type that might lead them into discovering Wright as part of a different kind of continuum than we can imagine. So for our part in the archive, we see students and scholars at every point in their careers, and we don't inform what they're doing except by the suggestion of materials that we have that might help them in those questions that they bring forward. So for us, it's the race to get it out there and to, I think, innovate on how we can expose the records that describe these things so that a worldwide audience can know the depth of the collection, which is incredibly rich. And then how the museum and the library, in a dynamic fashion, share knowledge about our discoveries and our descriptions of those collections. So it's very, as you can imagine, we both have closed systems where doing data sharing, even much less asset sharing, it's all new territory. And I think we're going into it with a wonderful attitude that we should make it work. We should set a new model so that these things become more accessible.
A small detail that always, you've heard this from me before, but many of you know that Frank Lloyd Wright is one of two architects represented in the Avery Library who has his own special spiral-bound finding aid. So if you, and in fact, this in some level demonstrates the surplus of scholarship. I mean, this thing is really thick. I don't know how many volumes are recorded in that. I actually would love to know the origin of the Le Corbusier one computes more in the sense of the canonical nature of that particular author in the discourse historically of this school since the 60s and art history as well. But the Wright one, it almost maybe even semi-consciously perhaps recapitulates the exceptionalism that Catherine, I think, is alluding to, both in the scholarship and even now, and we have to have a special section. Yeah, it's like overexposed and yet, yeah. Anyway, so do we further? Yeah.
You were mentioning a little bit the necessity of finding new techniques of archiving and new techniques of display. Do you want to talk at all about some of the technologies or digital platforms that you're considering for that, and whether the kinds of material that are in this archive, if they might necessitate a new kind of platform, or whether existing ones work?
Because it's a historic archive, unlike, say, 21st century architectural archives, which have born digital assets and present a whole different set of problems. This archive, I think, presents the range of things you'd find in a traditional paper-based, and media, fixed media and moving media. So there's oral histories, there's photography, there's film, all those sorts of media. You know, we've seen that before. What's different is that the way those things are treated from a preservation point of view, we have much more knowledge now, so they each kind of take a different path, which pushes them into a different archival setting for temperature and security issues, and humidity and all those sorts of things. But more complex, I think, is the technical platform that the data sits on, because typically bibliographic material, museum-like objects, and archival content each are described and organized in different ways. And we wish for the user to have a format-blind, platform-blind approach. I mean, if you're interested in one thing, you don't really care what the format is. You want to know all about it. So to do that within just a library system, much less within the library system and in the museum system, are the things that I think are the complexities of the repository structure. In terms of digital repository, everything that we do on the data side or in the digitization side then needs to have its sort of surrogate in the digital universe, and that has the same set of complex preservation and migration components for the life of the archive, which we hope will be forever. So it's complicated, but doable, I think. It just requires a lot of architecting of the information to begin with, and mapping of these schema, the data schema that will control the descriptions across, so that the discovery layer, which is the way the public will see this stuff, looks, very unified, even though the subsystems will be quite different. I don't know if that's what you were asking, but it's that's where we're heading. Probably, I would say, at least 3 or 4 data schema, and I would say 2 to 3 data platforms for the description, and then on the archive side, they'll migrate over to a Fedora repository in multiple instances.
Did you get all that?
Blah, 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 on Friday night.
And she was, don't forget, she was at Art Store before.
Yeah.
Gwen.
I'm curious whether there is an edge to an archive. That is, in both Taliesin East and West, are there objects, are there drawings that you and they decided should stay?
Yeah, we had a discussion about that, but all of what we're calling the formal name of it, we have the other slide up, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation Archives. All the works of Frank Lloyd Wright are part of the archive that Barry and I will shepherd. The things of his life, so the smoking jacket and his collections of Japanese screens, things that inspired him and that were part of his personal life, will stay with the foundation and be part of the historic presentation of Taliesin and Taliesin West. We also have within our agreement that we'll have a steering committee in which members from the Taliesin Foundation will join MoMA and Avery in discussions about how the presentation of material there and here will speak to each other. So that, as I say, I think the foundation was very thoughtful in taking this move of releasing the archive from the foundation's care and focusing on the historic sites. They're very, very concerned about the legacy of Mr. Wright, as he's called, out there, and in all aspects. So they're really focusing on that. And so the materials that were his personal things, kind of like the Mies correspondence, like what was personal and what was office, I don't know, it's a funny line. But we're actually on an almost object by object level rather than class by class level, separating those out and leaving very little, anything that was his and part of the production of work, written or drawn, comes with us.
I would say, actually, this goes back to the very first question. I mean, one really interesting thing is, well, of course, this archive is going to have a completely another status now. So Catherine talked about its possibilities, but it is the end of an epic. It is the archive exists because of 2 things: Wright's notion of his own historical importance, and secondly, it's a teaching archive. It's meant to perpetuate the Taliesin school. So someone will look back in 40 years at the history of the foundation, and a strategic decision had to be made that it was absolutely impossible to maintain 2 campuses of buildings and landscapes, a unbelievable archive with a demand with many, many pilgrims, and that, of course, is what it's going to change, is that many people who aren't pilgrims can maybe get into it, and end the period where the desire would be to have a journal called Frank Lloyd Wright Studies, as though that was somehow a discipline. And then the third is the active running of this school. So the background to this, before we come into the story, is the strategic but incredibly painful decision for them that the archive and the school would need to part ways. So it is the end of a strata of the history of these materials that is an integral part of its history, and there will be many scraps of evidence probably in the written records that would allow someone to study the the evolution of the concept of the archive with Wright, with Ogabala, with the school, with many other people. But of course, this is the status of almost any archive. It's kept together, for some specific reason, and it's also, of course, one of the big challenges in moving it into a new context is the discovery of, well, just kind of complete anecdote. When we were doing the Columbia seminars in the Mies van der Rohe archive, we spent an incredible amount of time on a certain number of drawings that just could not add up to what we were trying to imagine were the design history of these particular designs, particular projects. And then one day I said, why don't we test the hypothesis that just because it's filed under a project doesn't mean it actually is that project. And suddenly a certain number of drawings turned out to be unknown drawings from early Mies van der Rohe projects that were meant to have been destroyed because he was systematically destroying things in the early 20s. And then the whole question becomes, actually, the misfiling is an incredibly, kind of somewhere between Sherlock Holmes and Carlo Ginzburg. It's an incredible moment. So looking at, in this example, sorry, this is a little bit off of Frank Lloyd Wright, but I don't know the Frank Lloyd Wright archive. We might find, so that's why it's actually important for us to actually pay attention to the misfiling.
Yeah.
So suddenly we have a drawing for the Orbig House, the only drawing for the Orbig House. It happens to be filed under the Wolf House. It is published in the Mies van der Rohe archive, which is the dinosaur of publication projects on archives, as the Wolf House. And I don't know how many people are still trying to make it be a project for the Wolf House, but one day I said, well, why, what's it doing here? And it's obvious. It's the last time he tried to figure out how to make a terrace that changes in section in a landscape and wraps around the building. He said, get me the Orbig design. We did that there. It's in that, and that has actually assured its survival. So trying to even reconstruct those stories are themselves not simply objects of data filing and description. They are actually a part of the, in an interesting way, part of the historical record. So the archive is
certainly the case in Wright already. Janet, as I say, Janet Parks was out there the last 2 weeks packing up the drawings. And we had originally guesstimated a count of about 23,000, and after her inventory, looking sheet by sheet, she's counting closer to 25,000 or more for those very reasons. Sometimes drawings on 2 sides of a page, or things sandwiched together in one set of Mylar, but they're really 2 or 3 drawings. And as I say, works by other architects, Louis Sullivan in particular, turning up in places where you wouldn't expect to see them. So there'll be a lot of unknown. The foundation in particular, the staff, were particularly interested in anything with the hand of Mr. Wright. So those other things became, lesser known, buried away, and we'll be able to surface those as Shelley Hayra, our archivist, starts creating the finding aids to the collection. And we hope we'll have lots of student interns who wish to work on the collection as well. Find something unknown.
Well, we're headed towards a reception, and unless there are, I don't want to cut anything off, but as I myself, I have to say, we're going to repeat this in Buffalo. If any of you are in a slightly more kind of, let's say, maybe perhaps intoxicated atmosphere over wine before the panel rather than after it. If anybody's at SAH and wants to sign up, we're going to do a kind of analogous panel in the Martin House or Toshiko Mori's Visitor Center for the Martin House next week. So we thank you for also helping us think out loud about how and what to do, what to do there. Needless to say, please, to all of you who are actually presenting tomorrow, do come back tomorrow. This is, it's sort of the other side, the other, alpha omega. Okay, the other, let's call it the alpha side of the spectrum tomorrow. Where we're really cutting edge work. I mean, in the sense of like really fresh, work out of the archives, literally directly out of other archives, and perhaps eventually this one as well is going to sort of show itself on another screen over in Schermerhorn in 612, yeah, Schermerhorn beginning at 9:30 tomorrow morning. So I do urge everyone here to come back and bring your friends. This is always a very, very enlightening occasion. I personally look forward to it. And again, I thank Carolyn and Barry for helping us get it started. And now we can continue more casually over drinks outside. Thanks again. Yeah.